Hey friends, this is Derrick Broze with the Conscious Resistance Network, and today we're going to talk about 5G. Before we do that, I want to remind you guys to bookmark theconsciousresistance.com to get all of our latest content, to get our email newsletter, to make sure you don't miss anything. You can't rely on Facebook, you can't rely on YouTube. I'm not even using most of those platforms, so you want to follow us on our website or on minds.com/theconsciousresistance network. You can always subscribe to our text list or join our Discord channel if you're looking for ways to keep in touch. So, the story that I want to cover today is coming from Wired magazine, which generally does good work. Sometimes they have propaganda. You go back to some of the Silk Road stories around that time, and Wired was doing lots of propaganda. But in this case, this is an article written by Susan Crawford called Why 5G Makes Me Reconsider the Health Effects of Cell Phones. It's a really good article that I recommend reading. And she says she started by reading this book called The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells, where he starts talking about climate change and the environment and changes like that, and talks about how thousands of scientists, are resistant to looking at this evidence, and whether or not you agree with that or not. That led her to see a parallel, as she says, in another big news story: the hype and enthusiasm about 5G wireless as the quote thing that will make the existing communications model obsolete, and how many of us have seen that 5G is being promoted as the solution to all of our future, you know, ails, that we just ailments. All we got to do is just embrace 5G and the Internet of Things, and everything will get better. And she started to notice that there was actually something to be concerned about: the fact that there might end up being monopolies by the federal government. She also says, I've been impatient for years with people complaining about the health effects of wireless communications. The phrase tinfoil hat leaps to mind, I readily concede. So she's admitting that she at first had dismissed people who talked about, the dangers of cell phones, Wi-Fi, 5G, and now all of a sudden she's willing to look into that. And I think that is due likely to the work of people like myself and you guys out there who keep spreading information, because those who either are resistant or just don't want to look into the information eventually, when confronted with enough data, will hopefully have these same realizations. And as she says, she learns that hundreds of scientists and tens of thousands of others believe that the intensity of 5G represents a phase change, and that 5G's effect on mankind should be studied closely before this technology is widely adopted, which just seems to make sense. I mean, you'd think something so massive that's going to be developed and adopted all around the world would be tested in a wider manner than it already has been. And she says, denial rhetoric has been driven by companies interested in maintaining the status quo. The wireless industry is vitally interested in assuring us that 5G poses no issues, or that there's an unresolved debate, so we should trust the existing radio frequency standards. And that's where we are now. Now, she makes note of a few issues that I have brought up here on our show and on our channel: for the fact that the European Commission is focused on ensuring that the market players lead way in advanced wireless services, that they have rejected pausing to consider the human health effects of 5G, and that the FCC has acted the same. Basically, the health authorities, the governmental authorities, don't want to test it. They claim it's safe. But as she notes here, what if the FCC is measuring public health effects against a decades old standard? We've talked about this. These standards were developed in 1996, and they are out of date. And not only are they out of date, but they're not testing in the right way. So she says, I am bothered enough to suggest that we need better, more neutral standards based on widely accepted science. And she gives a pretty good summary here for those who have not seen my past videos. The SEC standard for measuring the health effects of EMR, electromagnetic radiation, is based on whether the exposure will heat human tissue over short periods. That standard was adopted in 1996, as I said, and so it's over 20 years old. But as she notes here, and as I've been saying, some very persistent scientists say that that's the wrong standard, because human cells can be disrupted by mechanisms that don't involve heating. So even if your skin isn't being heated, that doesn't mean you're not being affected in different ways. And she says these scientists are particularly worried about the effects on the skin and the eyes of bursts of 5G transmissions that may lead to short, harmful temperature spikes. Other scientists worry about mental health effects, sterility, cancer, and other problems. This is all things that we've been talking about here for a while. Canadian scientist Magda Havas, who writes about electromagnetic radiation at the University of Trent, says that governmental bodies and agencies say that non-ionizing, which means non-heating or it won't ionize your molecules, non-ionizing radiation is safe and can't cause cancer below existing heat guidelines. She says they're wrong. And this is one of the things that I've been arguing and debating with people. If you go on our 5G videos, particularly my city council videos, there's going to be people who just say, You guys are idiots. You're conspiracy theorists. Learn about radiation. This is not an ionizing radiation, so it's safe. And that's just where they're incorrect. That name alone, non-ionizing, it is deceptive and it gets people to think that that means there's no effects. But even if it's not ionizing your molecules, it doesn't mean that there aren't other effects in different forms. And study after study is showing this. So people need to educate themselves a little bit further. And she says there is sufficient scientific evidence of cellular damage caused by these 5G transmission. And the journalist goes on to say that the sweat glands are effectively acting as antennas in response to the very high frequency millimeter waves that 5G will be using. And as we've talked about here, the Department of Defense has also used millimeter waves for crowd control weapons. So they know that these exposures do cause burning of the skin or heating of the skin, and that makes people run away. That's how they do crowd control. So again, the FCC standard is very outdated, and it's just interesting to see her go through all the points that myself and you guys have been talking about for some time. She's saying, as an outsider, it feels to me that scientific concern about 5G's health effects is relatively underfunded, and that there's a lot of denial and confusion. She talks about Senator Richard Blumenthal, who has asked for evidence, and I've shown you guys those videos where he has said, "So we are flying blind here on health and safety." So overall, a really good article, lots of good links to things that we've talked about before. If you're new to this topic, then I do suggest you read it. But if you've heard me talk about this, then you've likely heard these same points. But this is Wired Magazine, just published this morning. Unless this is some kind of April Fool's joke, which I don't think it is, then this is a good move. Because if you look at this Susan Crawford lady, the journalist who wrote this, she actually has written about 5G in the past. So this was April 1st. Then she goes back to talking about 5G related to China, talking about telecom. So it's like she's touched on the issue before, but apparently she hasn't, before this today, considered whether or not there are harmful effects to 5G. So I think this is a big move in the right direction, that a magazine like Wired is willing to publish something like this, and we'll see what the response is, because it's, like I said, it just was published this morning at 7 a.m. and it doesn't have very many views so far, but perhaps that will change. Now, in relation to the 5G news, I want to go beyond just the health concerns and tell you guys what's happening on the national landscape. You guys have heard me talk about how the new race to 5G is kind of the digital Cold War, where China and the US are trying to get all of their infrastructure in place so that they can be the ones in control of, well, all of the technology of the future, essentially. And apparently, Karl Rove, that old Bush administration era political operative, is now getting involved in the wireless battle. And this is a pretty long article from, it's not extremely long, but I just don't want to get into the details right now, from Politico. But essentially what they talk about is how there are different politicians who are lobbying, including Karl Rove, for Rivada Networks, a politically connected company that wants the government to manage the sharing of 5G airwaves with wireless providers. So this is basically getting to the point where Trump seems to be supporting this idea of nationalizing the 5G networks. This would be big government further entrenched with big telecom, big wireless for 5G, when they literally just become one thing. We've already been complaining about how closely tied they are, and now people are lobbying to get the government to nationalize the 5G networks of the future. So much so that a bill has been introduced just in the last week called the Secure 5G and Beyond Act that would protect 5G networks and prevent the government from trying to nationalize 5G, 6G, or 7G. And this is because, as I said, the Trump administration has kicked around the idea of nationalizing at least some of the 5G network as a way to fight cybersecurity attacks. So we have Chairman Richard Burr of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Mark Warner, John Cornyn, Susan Collins, Tom Cotton, Marco Rubio, all coming together and saying that they do not want Trump to nationalize the network. Even some people calling this a socialist effort to nationalize the 5G network. And you can read a little bit further about that. But I just want you guys to understand the implications of this, that if not only are there the 5G health concerns, the security concerns, the privacy concerns, but as I've said for a while, and maybe I'm a little bit ahead of the curve right now, but I think I will be proven right in short time, when 5G comes live and this is, it's everywhere. You can't get away from it. We're continuing to see now a push for this nationalizing of the 5G networks. We're going to see a push to nationalize or to make the social media companies into public utilities. Well, we already know that Facebook has trust scores, scores about trustability of their users. So imagine a scenario where the government is now either in control of or very closely tied to, even further than they are now, of the 5G Internet of Things smart grid, and they're now in control of Facebook. And they have all this data about us. They have all this information about how to track us, our patterns, our habits. You're going to see the integration of the smart grid and the social media companies. And what does that lead to? It leads to a social credit score like there already is in China. I guarantee you this is where this is all headed. 5G, smart grid, social credit score, being able to excommunicate people out of society if they don't behave right, if they don't act right, if they're not following the party line. This is where this is all going. So it's a good thing that some of these people are, at least for the moment, resisting the nationalization of the 5G network, but I guarantee you that is where it's headed. It might not happen under the Trump administration, might happen under a future president, but I guarantee you in the next decade we will see that the integration of government, social media companies, the big tech companies, and the big wireless companies even further. And all that data, all that interconnectivity will lead to tracking, it will lead to monitoring, and it will lead to social credit scores and being able to ban anybody out of quote unquote polite society who doesn't act right. You need to be aware of this. You need to spread this information. You need to share this Wired article. Maybe people, your friends might listen if it's coming from a Wired article. If they don't want to listen to me or you, they might have some more respect for Wired. So share this article, share this video, keep waking people up, keep spreading information about 5G, keep asking questions. And until next time, remember, you are powerful, you are beautiful, and you are free. Peace.